stage in the middle of Washington, D.C. I'm Matt Damon. All this and much more when we return to this special edition of Journey to Planet Earth.
Major funding for Journey to Planet Earth was provided by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation to help people help themselves, the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, dedicated to strengthening America's future through education, the Turner Foundation, working to protect and restore the natural systems that make life possible. And the Wallace Genetic Foundation. The greatest private pleasure comes from serving the general welfare of all. Additional funding was provided by the Park Foundation, the Whedon Foundation, the Campbell Foundation.
Camera 1, take your position. Camera 2, start your move. Quiet, please. Stand by. Roll background effects. Anytime you're ready, Lester.
Within the environmental community, we've been saying for some decades now that the challenge is to save the planet. What we're beginning to realize is that the challenge is to save civilization itself. The stresses are building. They're building fast. Disappearing species, ice melting, rising sea level. You go down the list. We've not turned a single one of those around. It was Einstein who once said the thinking that got us into the situation we're in is not the thinking that will get us out of the situation. It requires a new mindset, a new approach, a new way of thinking. Recently, I was on a flight from Washington, D.C. to Beijing that took us very close to the North Pole. This meant that much of the flight was spent over the Arctic Sea. The thing that struck me about this was that wherever I could see the Arctic Sea, when there wasn't cloud cover, which was most of the time, I could see fracturing in the ice. It seemed as though it was everywhere. It was, in a sense, a sign of what's happening and what's going to happen throughout the world. In recent years, scientists have issued a flurry of studies about sea ice melting. They reported that in 1 week, an area of Arctic sea ice the size of the United Kingdom had disappeared. They were stunned.
The disappearance of sea ice in the Arctic is astonishing. The rate is much faster than any of the models had predicted, and I think that should be a warning sign to anyone who's interested in the health of the ocean and the climate of the planet.
Climate change is not a trivial issue, and we don't have to go beyond ice melting to see some of the consequences.
One of the areas where ice is melting fastest in the world is in the mountains of Asia, in the Himalayas and on the Tibetan Plateau. This is of particular concern because these are the glaciers whose ice melt sustains the major rivers of Asia during the dry season. The Indus, the Ganges, the Yangtze, and the Yellow River.
One of the challenges of thinking about a region like the Himalayas and sort of downstream of all those glacier-fed rivers is the relationship of that water supply to the reduction in glaciers, and that can have adverse impacts on actual food production.
I've tried to imagine what the Gangetic Plain with 407 million people would be like if the Ganges were not flowing, or the Yellow River, which is the lifeline of northern China. These glaciers not only sustain the flow of these rivers, they sustain the irrigation systems that produce much of the wheat and rice in Asia. This is the situation that we find ourselves in the early 21st century. It is a new situation. And it was why I was invited to Beijing, to share my concerns about climate change and food security with government officials. Based on my earlier experiences in China, I didn't expect it to be an easy few days. And they weren't.
On the morning of his first day in Beijing, just before delivering a speech to government officials, to the casual observer, it may have seemed that Lester Brown was a well-known celebrity. The reality was a bit more complex. Not all of the young bureaucrats knew about his long and at times controversial history in China.
A decade or so ago, I wrote a book entitled Who Will Feed China? And it pointed out when densely populated countries industrialize, you have to build factories and warehouses and roads and highways, all the things that come with modernization. And China was moving in that direction. I then suggested that in the near future, China would lose so much farmland to development that unless it imported massive amounts of grain and soybeans, it would not be able to feed its vast population. Now, when this book came out, it had an enormous effect in Beijing because I was not fully aware of the psychological effect of the very idea that China might have to import a large share of its food supply.
What Lester Brown didn't take into account was that it's difficult for the Chinese to forget the past. The many years of political turmoil and natural disasters that severely limited the availability of food.
And what I now know and recognize, of course, is that all the leaders in Beijing today are survivors of the Great Famine of 1959-61, when 30 million people starved to death. So this was a very sensitive issue. When I suggested in my book that China might not be able to feed itself, for a year or so I was sort of persona non grata in China. I had never experienced anything like this before. Later it was published, and when I met for the first time Premier Wen Jiabao, he said, you know, your book was very useful to us because it did lead to a rethinking and a restructuring of Chinese agriculture.
Despite China's agricultural success, Lester Brown was once again going to deliver a message government officials didn't want to hear. He was going to tell them that what they are most proud of, rapid industrialization, could once more pose a major threat to their food security.
It was with interest yesterday as I was flying from Washington to Beijing via the polar route, and we were within 240 miles of the North Pole. When in Beijing, one of the things I talked about was the melting of the glaciers on the Tibetan Plateau. Yao Tandang, one of the senior glaciologists in this country, has said that 2/3 of the glaciers on the Tibetan Plateau could be gone by 2060. This, he says, would be an unprecedented catastrophe. They know about the melting of the glaciers, but I don't think anyone has yet, in the public mind at least, linked the melting of those glaciers and the effect that will have on the grain harvests. What we're looking at is the need to cut carbon emissions 80% by 2020 if we want to have a chance of saving the major glaciers in the Himalayas and on the Tibetan Plateau. We don't have much time. We have to move quickly.
Later that day, as he prepared for an interview on China's English language television station, his warm welcome was about to turn cold.
Mr. Brown, welcome to Dialogue.
I'm delighted to be here.
We've been talking about this interesting debate as to whose role it is to help more with the environmental protection, especially to prevent climate change.
We're all in this together. We all have a stake in the future of civilization. Most of us have children, some of us have grandchildren. We have to think about their world now. And if we don't act to cut carbon emissions quickly, let's say
what about developing and developed countries? There has been a lot of debate between the two camps as to whose responsibility it is to cut first.
Though the interview started cordially enough, it didn't take long before it threatened to become a debate about who should cut CO2 more, the United States or China, the world's two leading sources of greenhouse gases.
Well, all of these we have heard, but you know, sir,
Not
the
really.
reality right now is...
What we're seeing now is that China and India, the two countries planning to build most of the new coal-fired power plants in the world in the years ahead, are the two countries whose food security will be most directly affected by rising CO2 levels, rising temperatures, and the melting of those glaciers. So,
But you haven't answered my question. Whose responsibility is it?
Everyone's. And it's our generations particularly, because if we do not succeed, the next generation is going to say to us, why didn't you do something when there was still time?
All right. The
And the question
responsibility is everyone's. And yet, who has the bigger capacity of dealing with this issue?
It's not either or. We're all in it together. I mean, China's food
So
security...
equal responsibility or not?
The atmosphere doesn't ask the question, are these carbon emissions coming from countries with high per capita or low per capita? Climate change is driven by the total amount of carbon emissions. As hard as I tried, I never could get the moderator to focus on what was most important. That all governments, regardless of their economic goals, needed to share the burden of cutting CO2 emissions. We are tied together now in ways we never imagined before. It is obvious that the climate system is a shared system. You can't change the climate in one part of the world without it affecting climate throughout the world.
The melting of tropical glaciers, of the glaciers in between the temperate zones, that's in the Himalayas, the Peruvian Andes, and other places in these lower latitudes, is going to be probably the most immediate cause of a lot of human suffering, the dislocation, and undoubtedly national security conflicts among regions and borders.
The link between economics, climate change, food security is probably stronger than ever before in our civilization. What climate change is doing is it's basically injecting a degree of vulnerability in the global economic system. You have new players today who are more powerful because the economies are stronger and who are able to exert more force in the world food markets.
If China wants grain, it has the billions and billions of dollars in foreign reserves to buy it. And the question is, who gets crowded out and what happens to them? You have a lot of food importing nations that really can't compete with China. That has enormous implications for the rest of the world.
Imagine 1.3 billion Chinese with rapidly rising incomes coming into the U.S. grain market competing with us for our grain supply, driving up our food prices. Like it or not, what happens to the glaciers on the Tibetan Plateau and in the Himalayas is going to affect all of us.
After a short visit to China, Lester Brown's travels took him to Japan, Korea, India, Turkey, and Italy. From world capital to world capital, over a span of 22 days. During a series of lectures and press conferences, he shared his ideas about the urgency of finding ways to halt global warming.
It is clear that Plan A, business as usual, is no longer a viable option. There's a real sense of urgency now developing on the climate front based on solid science. That will begin to move the economy in a carbon-free direction, which is where we need to go if we're going to stabilize the Earth's climate. I see my responsibility as trying to look ahead and see what's coming and then share that information with decision makers. Thank you very much.
The trip also gave him a chance to meet with political leaders. During private meetings and off-the-record conversations, he was often able to learn where government officials stood on sensitive environmental issues.
For example, when in India and meeting with Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, who is an economist and has done a great job of getting the Indian economy into gear and to begin to raise people out of poverty. When I talked with him about the melting of the glaciers in the Himalayas and the effect it would have on India's future food security, he knew about that. I mean, I was not telling him something he didn't know. But what he couldn't quite figure out was what to do about it.
When in South Korea, he was invited to meet with the mayor of Seoul, Oh Se-hoon, who was having difficulty coping with the public's reaction to a series of environmental issues. For weeks, the city was paralyzed by massive demonstrations.
This is a very busy day. So much is happening. You can hear the demonstrators from here.
Yeah. Korea is very, very dynamic.
Maybe too dynamic sometimes.
Too dynamic, yeah.
Just outside of the mayor's office, thousands were demonstrating against two government environmental policies: the importing of aged beef and the construction of a major but unneeded canal. In the evening, the crowd swelled to over 500,000.
What I found interesting wasn't so much the nature of their complaints, but rather that a call to action by the environmental community could generate such a huge response. However, what really caught my attention was what happened one evening.
As the demonstrators continued their orderly protest, something provoked the crowd. Suddenly, a peaceful demonstration turned violent.
For me, it was, in a sense, a look at the future. What could happen when even more serious environmental challenges, like global food shortages due to climate change, go unanswered? During the course of my road trip, it became clear to me that we are now faced with challenges not only on a scale and of an urgency we've not seen before, but challenges with a complexity we could never have imagined.
Please take the shuttle bus leaving from bus terminal number 3.
During my tour of Asia and Europe, I often had the luxury of time. time to think about the consequences of climate change and whether it could lead to food shortages on a global scale. However, the more that I thought about the future, the more my thoughts turned to the past. To past civilizations that suddenly collapsed. What I finally became convinced of was that most early civilizations that collapsed did so because of a severe decline in their food supply. It happened thousands of years ago, and it happened as recently as 500 years ago in sub-Saharan Africa.
In a remote part of Zimbabwe, there is a site containing the ancient ruins of what was once a thriving medieval city. The Shona tribe called it the Great Zimbabwe. Founded in the 12th century, its population grew to over 17,000 until it was abandoned in the early 1500s.
What really interested me was the story behind the city's collapse. That the Great Zimbabwe was deserted because depleted pastures and dwindling water supplies could not support its exploding population.
Certainly a number of past civilizations have failed because their food supply crashed. Often that was linked to a changing climate or an induced change in climate, or just poor agricultural practice, which in the end sort of reduced the ability to produce food.
I think in the past when we've looked at failed states, we're looking at some series of unintended consequences combined with catastrophes that struck and sort of pushed one civilization or a state or over the edge.
I often ask myself, why didn't the leaders of ancient civilizations make those connections before their cultures collapsed? Weren't there early warning signals that could have helped them save their empires? And what about today? Surely there must be something we could learn from what happened to the Great Zimbabwe or other failed civilizations.
The more Lester Brown became convinced of the link between food and lost civilizations, the more he integrated the concept into his prepared remarks.
We look at the Sumerians and the buildup of salt in their soils as a result of a defect in the design of their irrigation system. As salt levels built up, grain yields came down. They switched to barley, which is more salt tolerant, and eventually barley yields went down, and with that, the civilization went down. We look at the Mayan civilization, the most advanced in the New World, and we see deforestation and soil erosion undermining their cropland productivity. As the soil eroded, yields began to decline. As yields declined, the civilization declined and eventually collapsed. And I asked myself, could this happen to us?
His message was quickly picked up by the media, especially in Japan.
If we do nothing, things are going to get worse and worse, and everything will gradually begin to break down. And we'll join the earlier civilizations that were not able to make the needed course corrections. I have, until recently, rejected the idea that food could be the weak link in our early 21st century civilization. But I'm now beginning to wonder if food shortages could bring down our civilization.
If you were to visit the markets of the world, it's hard to imagine that food shortages could bring down civilization. Today, more food is available to more people in more places. than ever before.
But what will happen in the future when there's a growing demand for livestock and poultry products and on a scale the world has never experienced? There are 3 or 4 billion people in the world now whose incomes are rising, who want to move up the food chain, who want to consume a lot of livestock products, meat, milk, and eggs, as we do in the United States and the other industrial countries.
As middle-class populations grow in countries like India and China, and the appetite for meat and eggs and dairy products grows, it basically puts that much more stress on the land, because you have to produce the food not just for the people, but for the animals that produce those other kinds of foods. So it just, escalates the food problem.
As the world's economies continue to grow, food stalls will begin to offer more popular products like meat, milk, and eggs that will require massive amounts of grain for feed. It's beginning to happen in India, and we've already seen this become a reality in China, which now accounts for over a quarter of the world's consumption of meat.
The big issue on the planet is not just the fact that we're going from 6.7 billion people today to 9.2 billion, that the population in total is increasing. The big problem on the planet is actually the number of Americans who are increasing. That is, the number of people living an American lifestyle, eating American-sized Big Macs, living in American-sized houses, driving American-sized cars, on American-sized highways, in American-sized malls. In some ways, it's a wonderful thing that so many more people in China and India, Russia and Brazil can live an American lifestyle. There's just one problem with all these carbon copies of Americans. If we, the original Americans, don't redefine in more sustainable terms what it means to be an American, we're going to heat up, choke up, smoke up, and devour up this earth.
What we're talking about here is a train wreck where it's not clear how we can feed the world with a Western diet and also supply energy with Western demands, and at the same time curb carbon dioxide. Something has to give in that picture.
And now, in the last few years, we've seen the emergence of a third major claim on the world's grain supplies, and that is the conversion of grain into fuel for cars in the form of ethanol.
Hi, I want to talk to you today about something that's really important. Ethanol. Ethanol comes from corn. It's then added to gasoline to make it work better. It decreases
A series of commercials promoting the conversion of grain to ethanol failed to mention one key fact. It takes a lot of grain to fuel cars. For example, the grain required to fill a 25-gallon SUV tank with ethanol is enough to feed one person for a year.
This is crazy. All these cars are burning fossil fuel. But what if we went to America's heartland and we grew a renewable fuel? Ethanol, a fuel made from corn. So say 20% of these cars use ethanol, or 50%, 75%. Hey, call me crazy, but what if 100% of these cars are driving with ethanol?
But with the capacity to convert grain into fuel for cars, what we're beginning to see now is an emerging competition between the 800 million people in the world who own automobiles and who want to maintain their mobility, competing with the 3 billion poorest people in the world for the same grain. In recent years, 1/4 of the U.S. grain harvest has been diverted to the production of ethanol. However, America is the world's leading producer and exporter of grain. And when that grain is no longer available for feed or food, we have a global problem.
The demand for ethanol presented a problem, and that led to the world food crisis. It was one of the key factors that led into this food crisis we had in 2006, 2008, and that we're still feeling the impact of. The crisis we have today is driven by demand for food. Demand for food for consumption and demand for food for fuel or energy.
Somebody's got to produce that food. We have this religious belief that it will be produced, but we face a situation where world food stocks are at their lowest point in 45 years, where most arable land is under plow, where irrigation is stagnated. So where is it going to come from? I submit that you need something more than a religious belief that technology will save us to give me confidence that we can deal with this problem.
So we have three trends driving the growth in demand for food. Population growth, over 70 million a year. Rising affluence, 3 or 4 billion people wanting to move up the food chain, consume more meat, milk, and eggs. And then thirdly, the massive recent diversion of grain into the production of fuel for cars. But what also worries me is that we seem to be making the same mistake of ancient cultures, whose leaders ignored early warning signals or tipping points until it was too late to save their civilizations.
That's typical of the way a lot of population and environment interactions are happening in the world. Things just get gradually a little bit more stressful in an ecosystem or an environment, but people figure they can live with them. Things are a little more difficult, a little tougher, but people think they can get by. And then suddenly some kind of tipping point is reached.
The question is, have we reached those critical tipping points? Those environmental thresholds that could lead to a food crisis? If we have, then surely this will lead to a growing number of failing states. And then the question becomes, how many failing states before we have a failing global civilization? We don't know the answer to that question. We've not been here before, but it's one we need to begin thinking about.
During Lester Brown's world tour, he usually tailored his lecture to suit the background of his audiences. But one theme remained constant. He always tried to convey the urgent need to change by describing the early warning signals the planet was sending us, like the melting of glaciers and the mounting pressures on our food supplies. But of all the early warning signals, none resonated with audiences more than the growing number of failing states.
One of the things that I have begun to focus on as sort of a bottom line indicator of the economic and environmental stresses we're facing in the world is the number of failing states. Included in this group would be countries like Somalia, the Sudan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Chad, Haiti, Afghanistan, and now each year that list gets longer. Even the term failing states is fairly new in our vocabulary. Only in the last decade or so have we begun to recognize the failing state phenomenon. Simply put, a failing state is a country whose government loses control of its territory. It's where the capacity of government to provide personal security, to provide food security, to provide basic social services like education and health care has broken down and in some cases disappeared entirely. We see this in countries like Afghanistan, Somalia, Democratic Republic of the Congo. One of the best examples of this is Haiti. Today, as Haiti struggles with the aftermath of a major seismic event, it's become, like Katrina, a global symbol for catastrophic disasters. But well before the great earthquake struck, Haiti was already a humanitarian nightmare, a failing state that never should have happened.
Not very long ago, 60% of Haiti was covered with trees. Today, all but 2% of the forests are gone. Once, Haiti was self-sufficient in food, but as a result of uncontrolled logging and extreme soil erosion, food production could not keep up with demand. Soon, Haiti became the poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere. Millions lived in slums. Sanitation and healthcare were almost non-existent. And local gangs forced residents to pay exorbitant prices for clean water. Eventually, political alienation and environmental stresses led to frustration and then anger.
What does Haiti mean? Well, one thing it means is it shows how you get this nexus of forces, this interplay of forces of environmental degradation, population pressures, and political instability.
You have to think of environmental stress as kind of an underlying pressure, almost a tectonic stress within the society that increases the likelihood of violence but doesn't necessarily cause it by itself. It has to come with other things such as weak governments, availability of weapons, and also deep ethnic cleavages within a society that can make violence more likely. And then all of a sudden you get a dramatic outbreak of riots in the streets.
We saw the effect of this when world grain prices tripled in late 2007, early 2008. Because Haiti could not get enough food, violent protests forced the president to resign. Today, as Haiti tries to recover from a deadly earthquake, the reality is still bleak. No matter how much disaster relief the country receives, renewal can only come when Haiti becomes strong enough to address the environmental challenges that still plague the countryside.
In rural parts of Haiti, there's a long tradition of burying a baby's umbilical cord under a tree. This ritual has always strengthened a family's sense of belonging and its attachment to the land. But what will happen when there are no more trees? Will Haitians lose their deep connection to the land?
But on a more global scale, what I worry about is that the weaker and poorer countries of the world, all those teetering on the edge of becoming failed states, won't be able to cope with the mounting problems of climate change, water shortages, and food shortages.
One of the great paradoxes of climate change is that the nations that will suffer most are the ones that are already least capable of contending with the change, that is, the poorest nations of the earth, in terms of food, resources, water, agriculture, geometrically increasing population. I sort of sense that we're at about that threshold right now.
Climate change is a threat multiplier for instability in fragile regions of the world. If you have tens of millions of people migrating, both because of political instability that's exacerbated by either sea level rise or a natural disaster, you have a situation with millions more people who could be compelled to flee. This is a conundrum of problems that we may face in future years in regions that are key strategic interest to the United States.
We see this in many ways today. We see Afghanistan and now Pakistan being a training site for terrorists, for example. We see Somalia with piracy in the oceans, creating extraordinary headaches for the industrial countries trying to figure out how to protect the ships that move through the Indian Ocean and into the Suez Canal. We're faced with an extraordinary challenge. And I don't think we've yet grasped the full dimensions of it. It raises a fundamental question, which is how many failing states before we have a failing global civilization? How many failing states before we have a failing global civilization? Failing states before we have a failing global civilization. Most of us in the United States remember a corporation called Enron. In the late 1990s, it was probably on the cover of more business magazines than any other corporation in the country. Particularly memorable were their television commercials.
We inherit some ideas that are unnecessary. We have to jettison that excess baggage.
The spots were designed to promote Enron's creativity in developing new business opportunities.
Who have really creative ideas.
Years later, it turned out that Enron's creativity was based on a fantasy. In late 2001, some outside auditors began looking at Enron's books. And as they worked through the system and completed their audit, they realized that Enron, one of the most valuable corporations in the United States, at one point ranked 7th in total value, was actually worthless.
Today, a jury in Houston convicted former Enron executives Kenneth Lay and Jeffrey Skilling on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and related offenses. Lay, Skilling, and their numerous co-conspirators perpetrated an elaborate scheme to mislead analysts and investors about Enron's true financial picture. At a time when the company was foundering, these defendants perpetrated a lie.
The officials at Enron had devised some very clever ways of leaving costs off the books. So while they were doing that, everything looked great, but in the end it was bankrupt.
And as they knew, the truth was something very different.
What we are doing is exactly the same thing that Enron did, but on a far larger scale. We are leaving costs off the books. And like Enron, we also run the risk of bankruptcy if we don't correct the system.
What we have now is a situation in which the most pressing problems of the world, which are environmental, ecological, are ones that the market has no incentive to deal with. Basically, if I pump CO2 or other more intense greenhouse gases into the world, I pay no price for doing that.
But there will be another bill coming, and that bill is the cost of climate change.
The Amazon rainforest is a perfect example. Here, rain has always been the key to the rich diversity of life. But now scientists tell us that because of global warming, the rains that nourish the Amazon will very likely diminish.
About 5 years ago, there was a very disturbing result in a climate model that showed that at 2.5 degrees increase in average global temperature, there would be the beginning of Amazon dieback. There would be insufficient rainfall. It would dry out, have terrible fires, and ultimately displace about 25 million people.
In the Amazon, we would lose over 1 billion acres of trees that presently absorb vast amounts of CO2 from the atmosphere. We would lose almost 20% of all the species on the planet. And with them, we would lose the genetic information in plants and animals that could lead to the development of new drugs and cures for diseases.
How important is biodiversity? I don't know. How important is a nest to a bird? Planet Earth and all its biodiversity is our nest. It's what shapes us as human beings.
Losing the Amazon rainforest and the biodiversity that's embedded in it is, at the very least, a fantastic aesthetic catastrophe way worse than burning down the Louvre on purpose.
We're making choices that future generations are going to have to live with. And I don't really think it's our choice to destroy something that they're never going to get to see.
Yet most world leaders argue that the cost of drastically cutting CO2 emissions to save the Amazon rainforest or other regions threatened by climate change is just too expensive. But they forget the cost of inaction.
We need to make a real effort to bring the environmental costs of what we do onto the books. It's not that businesses who don't take account of that are engaged in fraud. It's just that we as a society need to get into a mindset where we understand that you cannot treat the atmosphere as a free good. You can't treat what you do to the environment as something that doesn't belong in your cost accounting.
It's quite clear that we are ignoring the true costs associated with environmental trends that are threatening our future. Just go down the list. The increased intensity of tropical storms and floods, deadly heat waves tied to escalating CO2 levels, the devastating consequences of offshore oil spills, and the growing number of endangered and vanishing species. We've not turned a single one of those around. Nature is the timekeeper. It is nature that determines the tipping points beyond which change becomes irreversible. Unfortunately, we can't see the clock, so we don't know exactly how much time is left. Many years ago, I wrote a book entitled The 29th Day. The title of the book comes from a French riddle that's used to teach school children exponential growth. You have a pond, and the first day it has 1 lily pad in it. The second day, 2 lily pads, and then 4, then 8. And each day the lily pads keep doubling. If the pond fills on the 30th day, when is it half full? The 29th day. Though only a children's riddle, for those who believe there's more than enough time to cope with a rapidly warming planet, let's go back and take another look at the pond. Let's say on the 20th day. Everything seems pretty normal. The number of lily pads are barely noticeable. And as the days increase, the pond becomes a sanctuary, a place dotted with pretty flowers and with more than enough room for local wildlife. By the time we reach the 29th day, there's still plenty of room. The pond is only half filled with lily pads, so maybe we'll make plans to do a bit of fishing the next day. The only problem is, on the next day, the pond is full of lily pads and will soon become a choking mass of dying vegetation, unable to provide a safe haven for wildlife. The question we now have to ask ourselves is simply this: has our planet already reached the 29th day?
I think we've done more than reach the 29th day. I think we are well into it. We're on an accelerating curve of change.
It's always hard with climate change to know exactly where you are and when the next molecule of carbon emitted into the atmosphere will tip the whole system into all kinds of feedbacks that we can't even predict or understand.
The point at which you see change may be too late. The point at which the system has already started to change, you may not be able to stop those changes.
There's clearly a precipice out there, somewhere. The problem is that You don't see it until you've dropped off the edge.
The bottom line is that the fossil fuel-based, automobile-centered, throwaway economy is no longer a viable model for us or anyone else. It's clear that business as usual will not take us much further, and the alternative to business as usual is Plan B. Plan B has 4 components. One is cutting carbon emissions 80% by 2020. 2, stabilizing population at no more than 8 billion. 3, eradicating poverty. And 4th, restoring the Earth's natural systems. That includes forests, soils, grasslands, aquifers, fisheries, and so forth. These components of Plan B are all tightly linked and integrated. In order to achieve one of them, we have to achieve the others. We can't sort of pick and choose. This is not a menu. This is a comprehensive, integrated plan. We have to move forward on all 4 at the same time. The population issue seems to have fallen off the table in recent years. We don't pay that much attention to it, but if we can't stabilize the world's population, we're probably not going to be able to stabilize climate.
If we're going to have another 2.5 billion people in the next 30 to 50 years, climate had better be good. Because if it's not, it is going to be a Herculean job trying to feed those people and provide them with access to fresh water.
To slow population growth, we must also find a way to eradicate poverty.
We have to remember that 3 billion people on this planet survive on less than $2 a day. Somewhere around 1 to 1.5 billion survive on less than $1 a day. It's very easy for the billion or so people in rich countries to forget exactly what life is like for the 3 to 4 billion very poor people on this planet.
One of the reasons that eradicating poverty is one of the 4 components of Plan B is that it holds the key to many other things. It holds the key to stabilizing population. And by eradicating poverty, we mean investing in people.
Bangladesh is one of the success stories of the effort that's been going on really since the 1960s to make good quality family planning and reproductive health care available to everyone who wants it.
What makes Bangladesh's success so remarkable is that it's one of the world's most densely populated countries. It's where 170 million people, over half the population of the United States, are crammed into an area the size of Wisconsin.
When people started working on health in rural communities in Bangladesh, family size was up around 6 or 7. Today it's half that, and still gradually trending down.
That success is also the result of the government's investment in education, especially for girls. In every society for which we have data, as the level of female education rises, the size of families shrinks.
Women and girls are the ones who are disproportionately impacted by poverty around the world, but also are the ones that can have the greatest impact on catalyzing change within communities.
Throughout Bangladesh, trained healthcare workers meet with women in rural villages and urban settings. Their sole purpose is to discuss family planning and encourage mothers to send their children to school.
If you educate a girl, she's more likely to marry later, have fewer children, her children are more likely to get an education, and so you really create a virtuous cycle that starts by changing the life of a girl who becomes a woman and having an impact on whole communities.
Bangladesh is not the only place where the empowerment of women has made an impact on reducing poverty and stabilizing population.
Istanbul is the thriving commercial and tourist hub of Turkey. Yet it has all the contradictions of a modern metropolis. A megacity with extreme wealth, juxtaposed against impoverished immigrant neighborhoods. Until recently, the community of Esenyurt was an economic and environmental nightmare. Life was particularly difficult for women. Only 7% held jobs, and it was unheard of for a woman to own property.
One of the more exciting development ideas that's had a big impact on women's lives is the idea that banks provide credit to poor and marginalized women, make them responsible for what they do with the money, make them responsible for repaying the loans. This is often called microcredit.
For the women of Esenyurt, the benefits of microcredit loans were enormous. It gave Ayesha Savas the freedom to start a career. With a $350 microcredit loan, she opened a cafe. It changed her life forever. Ayesha not only owns her own business, she has helped scores of other women get microcredit loans.
Microcredit is one of these win-win strategies that actually makes me really hopeful about the future of population and the environment. It tends to have multiple benefits that kind of ripple out from a woman to her family, to her community, to a nation, to the world as a whole.
Eradicating poverty is also one of the keys to protecting the diversity of life on the planet. One of the things we see in Africa, and particularly sub-Saharan Africa, where roughly 800 million people live and where populations are growing very fast, is that there's a growing protein hunger. And because of that, people are turning to wildlife as a source of meat in their diets. This is the so-called bushmeat trade. It has emerged over the last decade or two as a major threat to virtually all the mammal species in Africa.
"35 years ago, Zambia's Luangwa Valley was declared a 3,000 square mile protected sanctuary for over 90,000 elephants. But when drought and famine overwhelmed the local farmers, the elephant population was hunted for food and tusks until their numbers dropped to fewer than 15,000. And as poverty deepened, nothing could stop the slaughter.
In the face of poverty, people will tend to utilize whatever they can to survive, and that makes perfect sense. Our job as conservationists is to try and create environments where sustainable management is possible, where people can see things from a larger scale and learn how to manage things not just at the household level, but work collaboratively to manage things at a landscape level.
Villagers were taught modern farming techniques and offered economic incentives. In return, they had to stop poaching. But there was one other condition. The farmers had to turn in their snares and guns.
Since we've done this, we've had over 30,000 snares turned over. Hundreds of guns have been turned in because farmers have seen that by new ways of managing their agricultural output and new marketing strategies, they don't need to poach.
The results are impressive. By bringing a community out of poverty, farmers achieved food security, the elephant population increased, and ecotourism became a new source of income.
If we want developing countries to cooperate in protecting forests and protecting endangered species. All the things that we need to do to create a sustainable global civilization, we simply have to address the poverty issue. But beyond that, the challenge is to stabilize climate before climate change becomes irreversible, where we cannot stop global warming, where it spirals out of control. One of the most powerful signs of change is the growing grassroots movement opposing the largest source of CO2 emissions in the world, coal-fired power plants.
This is the most dangerous thing on Earth. A coal-fired power plant operating just the way it's supposed to operate destroys this planet.
Recently, thousands of demonstrators gathered in front of a coal-burning power plant located in the heart of Washington, D.C. Their goal was to bring public awareness to the link between global warming and the burning of fossil fuels, like coal, oil, and natural gas.
We adults told our children to clean up their rooms, but look at the toxic mess we're leaving our children to clean up. Shame on us! Shame on us!
The emotional call against coal-fired power plants has turned into a tidal wave of opposition throughout the country.
One of Utah's biggest energy projects is dead, and it appears largely because of concerns and uncertainties about global warming.
Since the beginning of 2007, public resistance has grown enormously.
We don't want coal-burning plants, and we don't want the pollution coming over to Missouri.
The bottom line is that in the United States, we are very close to a moratorium, a de facto moratorium on the construction of new coal-fired power plants.
If this plant is built, this would be the largest new source of greenhouse gases in the United States, and that's absolutely unacceptable.
What we're faced with now is a need to dramatically reduce carbon emissions.
Delegates from around the world gather in Copenhagen for the largest global warming conference in history.
Facing a clock some say has ticked down to zero, today 192 nations came together to take on a potential global catastrophe.
At the bargaining table, however, some of the sharpest divisions proved insurmountable for now. Frantic efforts underway, but still very much in doubt as to what they'll accomplish.
Though world leaders failed to reach a binding agreement in Copenhagen, most acknowledged the need to cut carbon emissions by 80%, but they talked about doing it by 2050. Lester Brown disagrees.
They talk about doing it by 2050 because that's what seems to be politically feasible. The question that we asked was, how much and how fast do we have to cut carbon emissions if we want to save, for example, the larger glaciers in the mountains of Asia? When you ask that question, then you get a very different answer. You conclude we have to cut carbon emissions fast, and for us that means cutting carbon emissions 80% by 2020, not by 2050.
This is going to be really tough. We're talking about, energy pervades our economy, and fossil fuels are basically the lubricant that has led to rapid development around the globe. It's not something simple that we can flip a switch and suddenly no longer emit carbon to the atmosphere. We have to change, in many ways, the entire way we live as a human society.
If I were to pick a single policy instrument that I would want to use to restructure the global economy in order to save civilization, it would be restructuring the tax system. Lower income taxes and offset that with a rise in the carbon tax.
You need to have the carbon taxes, or you need one way or another to put a price on carbon. If you do that in a way that generates a lot of revenue for the government, then we can afford to have lower income taxes.
Unless you price things at their real and true cost, unless you price gasoline at the cost of the troops protecting the oil coming from the Persian Gulf, the cost of the pollution we're putting in the atmosphere, that turns into childhood asthma. Unless you truly price the cost of these dirty fuels, you'll never get people to switch to the cleaner fuels.
The main lesson of the economics is, we can do this. This is not beyond our means. It doesn't require a radical new version of economics. It doesn't require that we totally rethink how we run ourselves as a society. It just requires that we put prices on these emissions.
Two technologies often mentioned that could lower CO2 emissions are nuclear energy and clean coal power plants.
The unfortunate reality is that building nuclear power plants has become far too costly to offer meaningful help in the near future. And as for clean coal, we're not even close to having technologies that can economically capture CO2 emissions from smokestacks and store them safely in the ground.
We're not going to resolve these climate change related issues simply by becoming better at doing the things that we're already doing. We really do have to try some fundamentally new and different things.
So the challenge now is to replace fossil fuels with other sources of energy. And the one that the world is turning to on a large scale is renewable sources of energy. We are now seeing the emergence of the new energy economy. Texas, for years the leading oil-producing state, is now also the country's leading generator of electricity from wind. But Texas is not alone.
Denmark gets 20% of its electricity from wind, and it's aiming for 50%. Off the coast of Scotland, there's enough harnessable wind energy to supply the United Kingdom with all of its electricity needs. And in China, massive wind complexes are being built that will equal the energy produced by 130 coal-fired power plants. But wind power is not the only renewable energy source available on a large scale. Geothermal heat is a huge source of energy. The easiest places in the world to develop it are areas where there is volcanic activity. In fact, the amount of accessible geothermal energy dwarfs the energy in all of the world's oil, coal, and natural gas reserves combined. The Philippines gets 1/5 of its electricity from geothermal power plants. Iceland is another country rich with this renewable source of energy. Today, 90% of its homes are heated with geothermal, virtually eliminating the need for coal.
And then, of course, we have solar energy. Today, China is the world's leading producer of solar cells on a large commercial scale. But the extraordinary power of the sun is not limited to the industrialized countries of the world.
The deserts of the Middle East and North Africa have always been rich with oil. But many countries realize they won't be exporting oil forever. Together with a consortium of energy companies, they are now developing state-of-the-art solar power plants designed to export electricity to Europe.
The Algerians point out that in their desert, which is most of the country, they have enough harnessable solar energy to power the world economy. That almost sounds like an error, a mathematical error, but it's not. In fact, the solar energy striking the Earth in 1 hour is sufficient to power the world economy for 1 year.
We're really on the cusp of this sort of fundamental restructuring of the energy system in a way that, and on a scale that we've never really tried before.
What we're now seeing is a fundamental change in the way the future can look. A future powered almost entirely with renewable, clean sources of energy. featuring high-speed intracity connections. Urban landscapes built to complement a highly electrified economy. Residential homes surrounded by green space and located within walking distance of commercial centers and light rail transportation hubs. In the future, cities will be designed for people, not cars. And there will be much less noise and air pollution, thanks to hybrid plug-in cars, all-electric cars, and state-of-the-art light rail. What an exciting place that will be, and what a legacy to leave the next generation. An economy based on energy sources that will never run out. We've never been able to do this before. Ever since the Industrial Revolution began, we've been investing in temporary sources of energy, oil fields that would run out, coal mines that would run out. Now suddenly we can build an entirely new world, a world powered almost entirely with renewable sources of energy. That's an enormous challenge, but it's one that we must face, and face with a sense of urgency. When I look at the enormous challenges we're facing in the world, the need, for example, to restructure the world energy economy, shifting from fossil fuels to renewable sources of energy, I sometimes go back and reread the economic history of World War II. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. January 6, 1942. President Roosevelt giving his State of the Union address.
I have just sent a letter of directive to the appropriate departments and agencies of our government, ordering that immediate steps be taken to increase our production rate of airplanes so rapidly that in this year, 1942, we shall produce
He said, we're going to produce 45,000 tanks, 60,000 planes, 20,000 artillery and anti-aircraft guns, and we're going to build several thousand ships.
Our task is unprecedented, and the time is short. We must strain every existing armament-producing facility to the utmost.
People were blown away by these numbers. No one had ever seen arms production numbers on this scale before.
Let no man say it cannot be done. It must be done, and we have undertaken to do it.
What Roosevelt and his colleagues realized was that at that time, the largest concentration of industrial power in the world was in the U.S. automobile industry. So after his State of the Union address, he called them the leaders of the automobile industry. And he said, we're going to rely heavily on you to help us reach these arms production goals. And they said, well, Mr. President, we'll do everything we can, but it's going to be a stretch producing cars and all these arms too. He said, you don't understand. We're going to ban the sale of private automobiles in the United States. And that's exactly what happened. From the beginning of April 1942 until the end of 1944, nearly 3 years, there were essentially no cars produced in the United States.
President Roosevelt makes an unprecedented 9,000-mile tour of the United States to see for himself the nation at war. He stops at the giant Chrysler tank arsenal, where he sees the Army's latest mechanized monsters tested as they come from assembly lines. Then on to one of Henry Ford's great bomber plants. Where automobile fenders once were made, aircraft propellers are turned out by the thousands.
The point of this example is that it did not take decades to restructure the U.S. industrial economy. It did not take years. We did it in a matter of months. Can we make the changes in the time that's available? I think so. But we're going to have to move very fast.
When you think about the American public, they can change on a dime. We think about long evolutionary periods, but to be perfectly honest, there are things that happen over a very short period of time where we look at things and we say, we're no longer going to do this, we're no longer going to accept this. I see it in political movements and I see it in social movements.
My personal experience during my lifetime with the dynamics of change is the civil rights revolution that began in the 1960s. Remarkably, in the course of 5 years, we went from 100 years of complacency through a civil rights revolution that culminated in the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
If I had said 2 years ago that the American public would accept an African American as their next president, we would have said this will take years and years and years. And yet, in the end of the day, we changed attitudes, and changed attitudes about how people look at America.
Change, which seems impossible, suddenly becomes quite real, very rapidly, driven by a massive change of understanding and attitudes that relate to values that are held by American citizens.
If we could restructure the U.S. industrial economy in a matter of months, then certainly in a matter of years we can prevent climate change from spiraling out of control. Because if climate change spirals out of control, it'll put so much stress on governments. We'll have so many failing states that it's quite possible that civilization itself could begin to break down. As I travel around the world, the question that I am asked most often is, what can I do?
They expect me to say, well, change your light bulbs or recycle your newspapers. Those are important, but we're at a point now where we need more than that. We've got to restructure the global economy.
Whether it's supporting the development of renewable energy sources, such as wind and solar and geothermal, or the adoption of plug-in hybrid cars, getting involved in the extraordinary movement in the U.S. to ban the construction of new coal-fired power plants, for example. Pick an issue, one of these issues that's important to you, and go to work on it. And it means becoming politically involved and pushing for the changes that are needed.
Individuals have to bind together and work cooperatively by electing people who want to solve this problem and by encouraging their governments to engage in international agreements to solve this problem.
I don't know how you have an international agreement where we all are not sharing information and ensuring that we are meeting our commitments.
You're trying to mobilize people to confront a gas you cannot see, touch, or smell, who will primarily affect your unborn grandchildren. That's a hard sell. It takes a very unique level of leadership and statesmanship and stewardship by one generation on behalf of another to really get people to act on this issue.
We're not going to solve this problem unless we get global political action. We're not going to get global political action unless the U.S. Congress passes strong environmental legislation. That's the starting point for everything.
I look at it through the lens of the American public, and you can look at it from conservative side or the liberal side of the aisle. And in that respect, the American public says, we want to protect our environment. We recognize that we have to make changes and adaptation.
I'm really encouraged by the fact that when I go to my hometown in Arizona, a small town of 50,000 people, candidates for local office are debating climate change. They're asking and taking positions about what should be done in county government to move toward alternative energy, to use conservation. Those debates are happening everywhere, clear down to the grassroots, in a wonderfully positive way that will yield national change.
It's an exciting new world, and one that will be much more interesting, much more satisfying, will have a much stronger sense of community than the one that we now know. Saving civilization is not a spectator sport. We all have to get involved.
We're looking at a race between tipping points, between natural tipping points and political tipping points.
Can we cut carbon emissions fast enough to save the glaciers in the Himalayas and on the Tibetan Plateau? Or will we watch them melt and disappear? Can we phase out coal-fired power plants fast enough to save the Greenland ice sheet? Can we arrest the deforestation of the Amazon basin before the forest is so weakened that it becomes vulnerable to natural fire? These are the questions we're facing as a civilization. And my final point would be this. Saving civilization is not a spectator sport. We all need to get involved. This is the situation that we find ourselves in the early 21st century. It is a new situation. It is unlike anything that civilization has faced before. Those of us in the environmental community talk about saving the planet, but it's really now civilization that we need to save.
For over 40 years, Lester Brown has been a major voice of the environmental movement. He continues to travel around the world, meeting with heads of state, as well as today's most respected and influential thinkers. But perhaps his greatest gift is providing us with a clear and universal vision of the world around us, where first light still reveals the rich tapestry of the natural world. And with each new day, there exists a chance for every child to share the same dreams we so often take for granted. What we need now are the efforts of people everywhere. All those who are seeking ways to strike the right balance between what we want and what nature can provide. Though separated by distance and culture, for the nearly 7 billion people who draw sustenance from the resources of the world, there are common bonds. Bonds that are renewed by each generation, bringing new ideas, new attitudes, new hope. Planet Earth. This is our home. This is where our journey of discovery must begin. To discover more about today's featured stories, educational resources, or download teachers' guides and other information about the environment, please join me on the Journey to Planet Earth website at pbs.org.
To purchase a DVD of Plan B, Mobilizing to Save Civilization, or the book on which the program is based, call 1-800-553-7752 or write to the address on your screen.